Parliament's budget watchdog, Yves Giroux, is with me now. Hi, Mr. Giroux. Good to see you as always.
Always a pleasure.
You released this week your economic and fiscal outlook. So let's start on the economic side of things and the outlook that you are seeing. When it comes to growth and inflation, what's in the picture?
What's in the picture for the next year, or for this year, in fact, is very sluggish growth due to the impact of the monetary policy, the increase in interest rate that we have seen over the last several months, as well as slow economic growth from the consumer side. And for the next year, we see a small rebound as exports continue to drag growth, and also consumer demand starts to pick up again. When it comes to inflation, we see that the inflation is expected to come down to about 2% by the end of this year, as a result of, again, the Bank of Canada tightening monetary policy, increasing rates. So that's the good news. And we also expect the inflation to remain around 2% for the foreseeable future in 25, 26, and 27.
What's the biggest upside risk to that in your view?
The biggest upside risk on the economic side is stronger economic growth due to export into the U.S., because we have seen recently that the U.S. economy has been more resilient than what most observers were expecting. There's also the possibility that consumer demand remains strong. So these are the two main risks. On the upside, not really risks, but potential surprises on the upside.
So the other risk that has kind of been discussed when it comes to the Bank of Canada and its key lending rate is the idea that they could overshoot and essentially do more of what you've described has already happened by impacting the economy with either further rate hikes or even just keeping things where they are and not bringing them down at the right time. What do you assess the risk of that to be? Basically, what is the risk of a recession?
We don't think there's a very elevated risk of recessions right now. But in our economic and fiscal outlook, we think that based on the current economic conditions and what we expect them to be in the next couple of months, the bank could be in a position to start lowering rates in April, but that's based on economic conditions. There could be other factors weighing on the bank's decision as to the timing of the next decision, the next interest rate movement, so decrease in interest rates. For example, inflation expectations or the credibility of monetary policy. So that's up to the bank to decide, but economic conditions warrant a decrease in interest rates starting in April. If that was to be delayed to May or June, for example, it would not affect that much the economy. It would have a marginal impact. But if we were to see increases in interest rates or further delays beyond June, that's where we could start to see a more important impact on the economy, a more downward impact on the economy.
Yeah, you took the words in my mouth. I was just going to ask whether, I don't think anyone thinks at this point there are going to be hikes, but certainly the expectation has been slowly edging out as to when they might start to decrease rates. And if it does go beyond the first half of this year, maybe even into the end of the year, in your estimation, would that potentially have a tangible impact on economic growth?
It would start to have more bite, because if monetary policy has a 12 to 18 months lag before its impacts start to be felt. So delaying the decrease in interest rates would maintain monetary policy tight for longer than what economic conditions warrant. At the same time, the bank is reducing its holdings of bonds, of Government of Canada bonds, notably. So there's already an impact of tightening there. And to maintain interest rates at the level at which they are for much longer than necessary poses negative risks to the economy.
The finance minister is writing her budget, which she announced this week, will be tabled on April 16th against the backdrop of everything you described. You crunched those numbers as well, kind of where we are at compared to the fall economic statement and the budget. What does the budgetary balance look like compared to what we thought it was?
Compared to our economic and fiscal outlook in the fall, in October, our most recent outlook suggests deficits that are likely to be about $8 billion higher for the foreseeable future, so for the next 5 years, including in the current fiscal year. We expect the deficit to be about $46 billion That being said, we don't have any inside information as to what the government is currently doing or what plans it has for the remainder of the fiscal year. But based on publicly available information and what we were able to gather, $46 billion seems to be the most likely number for the current fiscal year.
What's driving the increase based on the numbers you crunched?
It's mostly increased spending. So spending on program expenditures, as well as interest. So interest, the cost of interest on the national debt.
And so my understanding is, even though you account for increases in spending, it's not everything that's been announced, right? So there's still a very recent pharmacare announcement involving diabetes drugs as well as contraception. There's a disability benefit, which still has to, though the legislation has received royal assent, hasn't been implemented because that happens through regulations. And then whatever is promised in the budget. Based on the fiscal anchors that the finance minister set out in last fall's budget, how much room do you assess they actually have for new spending?
So that's an interesting question. Last fall, the Minister of Finance, as you mentioned, introduced a new fiscal anchor that deficits in 2026 and 2027 and beyond would be at 1% of GDP or below. But even before the budget, we estimate that the deficit for that year will be at 0.8% of GDP. So that leaves very little room for additional expenditures without increasing taxes. It's probably $6 or $7 billion in room for maneuver in 2026-27 based on the current fiscal track. Of course, if the government decides to reduce expenditures in some areas or increase taxes, it would improve its room, but as things currently stand, there's not that much room to increase spending without increasing taxes.
And they haven't signaled on either front, really, that is what an avenue that they're pursuing.
You mean increasing taxes?
Yeah, like they haven't
No.
said beyond what they already are doing, that they're either going to increase taxes or find savings in addition to what they announced in last year's budget, which you have pointed out is really like a small sliver of overall spending.
Exactly. It's about $15 billion over a number of years. I think about $4 billion per year at maturity. So it's not sufficient to fund a national pharmacare program, which is still being talked about, or a Canada disability benefit, which could cost anywhere between $2 and $20 billion. Hopefully closer to the 2 than the 20, but who knows? Or it doesn't contain any additional resources for national defense to meet the target of 2% of GDP that NATO is calling for.
Very good points. Lots to think about in the lead up to that budget. Mr. Giroux, I appreciate your time and your insights today. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.